think Sherry was trying to give me a challenge with this one because I'm a macro person and this is about as micro as they get, I think.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell, your propositions don't get outside of the individual's head, right? So that's about as micro as it gets. So I think she's trying to stretch me out here, see how far she can stretch me.
You're assuming you remember the paper at this point.
Well, you know,
Right.
I know the AMR backlog is legendary.
Yeah.
So, the stealth mission of this series is to give authors a chance who have been waiting in the queue very patiently for a long time to get some exposure for their papers. So, I gave it a read yesterday, so it may actually be fresher in my mind than it is in yours.
I'm certain that it is.
We'll ask you to explain it. It'll be a test. We'll have you walk us through it.
Oh no, I'm not going there.
That's a great idea, Heather.
No. We don't. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Academy Management Review's Origin Series. My name is Rich McAduck. I'm an associate editor at AMR and your host for the series. I'm also a professor of management at Purdue University's Krannert School of Management. For today's episode, we'll be interviewing Christine Bataille and Heather Vough, who are together the co-authors of a paper called More Than the Sum of My Parts, an Intrapersonal Network Approach to Identity Work in Response to Identity, Opportunities, and Threats. Well, welcome to the Origin Series.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So give us a brief, maybe 1 or 2 minute elevator pitch for the paper. What's this paper about?
Okay, well, this paper works at the intersection of 2 themes in the identity literature and then pushes them a little bit. So one of the themes in the literature is that we as individuals have multiple identities. We're not one thing, right? We're parents, we're friends, we're athletes, we're professors, right? So we all have multiple identities. And so in order to understand behavior, we need to understand those different identities and how they impact each other. So that's sort of one stream of literature. Another stream of literature that complicates things is that not only do we have these identities, but they're also changing, that we're constantly engaging in identity work to update or protect or defend or maybe enhance the identities that we have. So if we put those together, we have sort of this complicated idea of multiple changing identities over time.
So can I pause you there? So I found it interesting that the literature uses this phrase identity work.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than maybe identity formation or identity reconfiguration or identity something. What's work like about it? Why work? Why do we call it identity work?
Well, so there are multiple terms. There's also identity constructions, another one that's similar, and different people have different perceptions of how identity work and identity construction are related. And there are authors who have talked about the difference between identity work and identity play. Arguing that identity work is more sort of this effortful response, maybe to more negative events, is I think sort of the implication, where play is more forward-looking and trying things out. The way I see it, however, is that identity work kind of encapsulates all of this, and that play is like a sub-component of it.
Okay.
I think the meaning of work is really just that it's, and it maybe, I don't know if effortful is the right word, but it is just something that we engage in, that we kind of have to do. But it's a good question.
Well, I apologize for interrupting the flow of your elevator pitch. Continue.
No, that's fine. There's a question out there about what that metaphor really means. So it's a valid question. So anyway, so with that premise that we have multiple identities and that they are changing, we started to ask the question, or we were thinking about different events that happen at work, and how events can actually change this network of identities. And our central argument in this paper is that identity implicating events, as we call them, can impact the network. And the way they impact the network depends on if people appraise those events as threats to their identity versus opportunities to their identities. So the argument is that if it's an opportunity, we think of it one way, we engage in certain behaviors with certain consequences, versus if it's a threat, we respond in different ways. So I think that's the 1 minute elevator pitch.
That's a shorter pitch than I've gotten from most authors, so I appreciate That's good. Okay, so let me follow up with that. This is by asking you to maybe dig into perhaps more of the details of what that means and what you're actually proposing here. This is a figure 1 from the paper. I can also show figure 2 if you want me to at some point. But maybe talk us through this web of connections that you've drawn here in figure 1.
Well, this is the 4,627th model that we drew for this paper, so keep that in mind. Christine, if you don't mind, I'll start, and then please
Go for it.
at any time. So as I mentioned, our model starts with this idea of identity implicating events. As we'll talk about later, previously we went into much more detail about those, but in this version, we kind of just put those aside and say something has happened at work that makes you think about your identity. And in response to those, we engage in identity work. And there are so many different types of identity work that people could possibly be engaged in. I think there's probably 1,000 different terms that have been used, but just for the sake of simplification, we narrowed it down to adding new identities, or meanings and enactments and identity, or subtracting them, or kind of doing both at the same time, like taking an identity away and then putting another one in there, which we call replacing. And so, yeah, that was really about just the existence of an identity. Like, do you have the identity? Do you not have the identity? Or do you have a new identity that replaced another one? And then the other option is changing what's in that identity. Like, you're still a professor, but how you define being a professor might change. And that's where the content changes happen. Just trying to figure out where to go next. Well, so our argument is that identity threats and identity opportunities are likely to impact these things differently. So like an identity opportunity is most likely to lead to adding, because an identity opportunity is when you see a chance to become someone new, to take on an identity or identity content that you see as positive. And so like adding an identity is likely to happen in response to identity opportunities, or perhaps replacing. In contrast, for identity threat, we're more likely to try and get rid of that identity. If we have an identity that's, facing harm, we might not want to be associated with it anymore. So we might subtract it, or we might try and replace it with something else. And then for both identity opportunity and threat, we might change the content of our identities to kind of address those two appraisals. Okay, and so one of the core moves that we make, I think contributions that we make in this paper, is to say, okay, identity work happens, and there's a lot of work in identity work out there. But what's important is that this identity work does not only impact the identity that's being worked on, but it impacts the entire network of identities. And so that's where that black box comes in. And in that black box, we talk about two different types of relationships between identities. So the first type is ties. And ties are just how do two different identities impact each other? And there's kind of three ways. So one is they can have a negative impact, they can conflict. Like maybe you have two different meanings with different identities, and who am I if I have these two different meanings? Or maybe you have expectations with one identity that are in contrast to an expectation of another identity.
Right.
Or they can be synergistic. They can have a positive impact on each other. So, maybe you learn something in one identity that's really helpful in your other identity. We talk a lot about like a leader and a coach, right? You're coach of a volleyball team, for example, and you learn things there that you can then bring into a leader role. So that would be an example of a synergistic tie. And then finally, we argue that there's also compatible ties. And those are really just the ties that aren't conflicting, aren't synergistic. They're just two identities that you have. So we are arguing that all identities in the network are tied to each other in one way or another, have one of these three types of ties.
There's never a pair of identities in my network that are just completely disconnected from each other.
Well, that would be sort of a compatible tie, right? They can coexist, but they don't really impact each other in any way. And then the second way of thinking about the relationships between identities is in terms of a hierarchy. And this is which identities are most likely to be brought to mind across situations. So highly salient identities kind of come up all the time. So often like demographic identities are like this, or just identities that tend to be really, important to us come up frequently. And so there's a hierarchy, right? There's those really salient identities that we have, and then there's less salient identities that we have. And so our argument here is that as we engage in identity work, things can change in the network in general. So maybe you add a new identity through identity work because there's an opportunity, hey, I can be this new thing. But that could in turn cause new conflicts that you never even anticipated. Or maybe there's new synergies that are created. And also you'll have to figure out, where does that identity work fit into the hierarchy? So it's not just that one identity is impacted, but the whole network has to kind of move and adapt based on that. And so finally, the last part of our model is this idea of inter-identity work. And this is the efforts that people put into addressing the relationships between identities. So it's not just about this one identity, but addressing like conflict. Conflict is an uncomfortable experience. People don't want to have conflict. And so how can they work on lessening conflict, or perhaps even creating synergies? Or maybe addressing the salience hierarchy and changing what identity is most salient. And so it's not that identity work happens and it changes the network and then it's done. It's that it can change the network in ways that then people feel like they need to respond to through this inter-identity work. Okay, Christine, what did I miss?
No, that was brilliant, Heather. You did an amazing job. So I'm quite impressed, actually.
I think so too. I will confess that the part of the paper that I had the most trouble with was the inter-identity work part. It was most challenging for me to kind of follow that part. I did have one other question though, and I hate to be reviewer number 2, but I had a little bit of a confusion about how you distinguish between changing the content of identity versus raising or lowering its salience, because those seemed like they could be somewhat similar types of activities to me.
So do you want me to take this, Christine?
Go, you're on a roll, Heather, go for it.
Excuse me. So when we talk about the content of the identity, we're talking about one of 3 things. And this is sort of an insight that we had as we went through the paper. Well, we recognized Jen Petrilieri's insight and then integrated it in. She talks about how identities have meanings, enactments, and value. And so those can be changed. Like, you have a label, say professor, and there's all sorts of different meanings that we associate with that: researcher, teacher, service person, whatever, mentor, right? All sorts of different things. And then there's all sorts of enactments, like we go into the classroom and we talk to our students, or maybe we do it online. We sit in front of our computers and write papers, like, these sorts of things that are associated with our identities. And so those things can change, right? Like you can add new meanings to an identity or new enactments to an identity. It doesn't necessarily change where that identity falls relative to other identities. It could conceivably, but just definitionally, you add mentor to the professor identity. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a more salient identity.
Right. Okay. I understand now. Okay. So yeah, I was thinking about it in terms of, okay, I'm going to make my let's say my parent identity more important than my work identity at this point in my life for a certain number of years or something like that, and that would be a hierarchy piece, but that could also involve changing the content of those identities.
Perhaps.
Yeah. So That's what I was thinking about. Okay, cool. So now I think I understand it. Okay, so good. So who is the target audience for this paper? Who should read it? Yeah.
I mean, obviously everybody, but I think, I mean, there's a lot of people interested in identity out there. So I think there's something for every identity scholar in it. But if we want to parse it down even more, I think those interested in identity work and those interested in multiple identities, it definitely speaks to those two groups.
Okay. Is there a secondary audience for this beyond just identity researchers?
It's a good question. I mean, and Christine and I have been playing around with ideas around this, but like it would be interesting to talk to some network people, like some like really network focused. I mean, what we're doing is very different, but we draw a lot of ideas from the network. Like it's a network analogy, really. So I don't know what interest they would find in it, but maybe there'd be some ideas generated.
Yeah, I guess so. If you literally view every identity as being connected to every other identity, like you said a few moments ago, and just they're compatible rather than synergistic or counter synergistic or conflicting, then you eliminate a lot of the important concepts from network theory, like centrality, right? Because if everything is connected to everything else, then everything is equally central. So that could be an interesting conversation to have with folks in the network literature, because they might give you some pushback on some of those thoughts there.
And I mean, it also, I mean, the analogy only goes so far, right? Like it's one person, so brokering doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Like, you know, brokering between two different identities within the same, well, yeah, we already know all of our identities. Yeah. So yeah, the analogy only goes so far, but it could be an interesting conversation.
Right. So I guess I also, you know, being, like I said, being more of a macro person, I wondered if this, if your propositions have any implications for people who study things beyond just what's going on in the individual's head, right? If there's people who study, you know, interactions between people who would benefit from reading this, who would be the most likely audiences of people who study interactions between people who would benefit from reading this paper.
Well, I think that comes back to the identity literature also, though, Rich, because we often talk about that identity is socially constructed in a sense that, you know, who we are is very much in relation to other people, and many of our identities are social identities. And so how we fit into a particular group or even in a dyadic relationship does impact who we are and how we see ourselves. So that element does come in the identity literature as well.
Okay, cool. So this is, of course, the AMR Origins series. So we do like to talk about the origins of the papers that we're discussing with their authors. So how did this project get started in the first place? Where did you get the idea for it?
That's sort of my fault for the very, very early stages. So the original idea actually stemmed from a project that Heather and I worked on together. So I was a doctoral student at McGill and she was an assistant professor. And we both worked with Dr. Mary Dean Lee on a study of baby boomers and retirement trends. And so we interviewed this entire research team, about 100 retired and nearing retirement executives and managers. And one of the papers that came out of that project was looking at how these individuals narrated the ending of their careers. So the subset of that sample that had actually retired. And the interesting thing was, after multiple iterations before the paper actually got published, we finally realized that the stories, the narratives really differed based on whether the individual conceptualized retirement as a threat, an identity threat, or what we decided to call an identity opportunity. And it turns out there's a lot of literature on identity threat. The concept of identity opportunities is out there, but there's really a dearth of research in that area. So that was imbalance. Yeah. Yes, exactly. The other thing is at this time, I was also working on my dissertation. I was interviewing women who were both professionals and mothers. And I asked them to tell me about the significant career and family turning points in their lives. And many of these stories, again, had hints and elements of threat versus opportunity. So these two things came together. I finally got my PhD. I started as an assistant professor. And then my first summer after starting my job, I started to put these ideas together. And I'm also thinking I had stopped, Heather and I had ended most of these projects from this retirement study, and I really wanted to work with her again. So I wrote a one-page pitch around identity opportunities and sent it to her and said, Heather, do you think there's anything here? And these are really early ideas. talking
Right.
about Jen Petriglieri's paper on identity threat and how we might be able to build on that with identity opportunity. And she said, I definitely think there's an potential for a theoretical contribution. And we both agreed that AMR would be the right target. And so we started the project back in summer of 2015.
Okay. So obviously, so the paper started with that one box in your diagram, the identity threat, identity opportunity box in the lower left of your diagram. But of course, there's 4 other boxes.
Sure.
So it must have gone beyond that. So tell us a little bit about how it developed further beyond just being a paper about identity theft versus identity theft. Man, identity threat. Man, I have actually been the victim of identity theft. So
oh dear. Okay,
that phrase rolls off the tongue rather easily. But identity threat versus identity opportunity. How did the paper move beyond that one box?
Well, the first step really was digging into the literature. So both Heather and I did a lot of reading, and she's actually the one who discovered this paper by Lakshmi Ramarajan in 2014. And this is where the intrapersonal identity network, that's the term I'm looking for. The idea was presented. And so Heather's the one who said, I really think identity opportunity is not enough for a real theoretical contribution. Let's bring in the identity network, looking at multiple identities. And then it really was the AE and the review team that pushed us to really compare. So why do we care about identity opportunities? How do they really differ from identity threats? And what's the implication? And Heather, you may recall other pieces, but that's my recollection.
Oh, I went back down memory lane last week, I have to tell you, and the various iterations and complications and oh,
the models and the outlines. Oh my goodness, how many outlines do we have, Heather? And you're right, about 4,000 models. So yeah.
Christine always laughs because I write like outline 5,627
with a little smiley face. Yeah,
it feels like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Christine hit on some of the key things. That before we did the first submission, we were on to the network part. That was something that was there from the beginning and stayed. Not much else did. And I mean, I don't know why I wanted to complicate everybody's life so much, but I did feel like that was maybe an opportunity to make some contributions, was incorporating the network. But almost everything else in the model from the original submission to when it was published changed dramatically.
Right.
The editor was very keen on us including identity threats in addition to identity opportunities, because we just wrote a whole paper about opportunities and the implications of opportunities and all that, and threats was sort of like, this is to supplement threats, but he really called on us to make them more parallel, which was a challenge because it really doubled what we had to do in the paper, right? All of the arguments, all of the pathways. We now had to do twice. And
far more than doubled the amount of literature you probably had to cite.
Right.
So much more threat literature than opportunity literature.
Right. And so what that ultimately meant, a couple of, manuscript submissions later, is that a lot of the things that we had in the original drafts fell out. We had a ton of moderators in there. We had outcomes. And all these things just couldn't fit. There was not enough room for theorizing all of that. So what you really see is sort of the middle part of the original early models. I mean, I remember very early on those identity implicating events. We spent a lot of time looking at the previous literature and what type of events people have previously figured out or identified as being identity implicating, though they don't use that term. And had a categorization of that, and then realized, okay, there's not so much value there, so that kind of dropped out. So yeah, it changed quite substantially.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons in this story for junior researchers who maybe have never done a theoretical contribution before, because I think, first of all, one thing that your experience tells me with your thousands of models and thousands of outlines, whether that's exaggerated or not, is that it may be only slightly exaggerated, but it tells me that there is a lot of experimentation in the theorizing process, right? And I think that's something that a lot of people don't fully appreciate if they haven't done theory work, is just the sheer amount of experimentation that goes into playing with these ideas and seeing how they fit together and seeing, how much is too much, how much is too little, right? So like you said, a paper that was purely about, the identity threat versus identity opportunity box would not have had much to say, right? You had to bring in the intrapersonal identity network in order to have a dependent variable for the threats and the opportunities to impact, right? So there was, there's choices to be made about, what are our independent variables? What are our dependent variables? How many is too many? How many is not enough? What scope of variables we want to consider? Like you said, you had to trim out some extraneous moderators and some extraneous outcomes in order to be able to focus on the piece that you wanted to focus on, or at least that the reviewers wanted you to focus on, or that ultimately became the paper. So I think there's a lot of experimentation that goes into the theorizing process, and I just think that's underappreciated. And so maybe could you tell us a little bit about what that experimentation process was like for you? What practices did you engage in your experimentation, and what can junior scholars who haven't done theorizing before learn from the experimentation that you did in terms of informing their own experimentation processes as they toy around with ideas to trying to build them up into a theoretical contribution?
Sure. Well, I can start. I'm more junior than Heather, obviously. So she had already published in AMR before and also in many of the top journals. So this was really a new experience for me. We actually did a lot of experimenting just between the two of us. So I would write a section on identity opportunities and she'd come back and give me feedback. And then she brought in the network. And initially I was like, this is really going to complicate things. And it did initially, but we went back and forth. We worked really well together. And so I learned a lot through that process, but it really was a lot of experimentation because we didn't actually submit the paper, I don't think, Heather, until January of 2019, if I remember. So that was that's 2015, 16, 17, 18. That's 4 summers of just the two of us going back and forth.
Wow. Okay.
But Heather had enough experience to say we should not submit this. If we want an R&R, we should not submit this. We actually sent it out for a friendly review a couple of times as well. And I think that's another important part of the process. So we got a lot of feedback before Heather was like, okay, I think it's, we're ready now to go ahead and submit.
So you had literally multiple years of iterations.
Yes.
Where you were deciding, is this ripe yet? Is this ready yet?
Exactly.
And saying no. So what was your criterion that you were applying when you were thinking about deciding, is this ready for submission yet? Or is this ready for friendly review yet? What is the, what was the criteria for making those decisions?
Over to you, Heather.
One, I can't look at this paper anymore. It's going to drive me absolutely nuts if I read it one more time. This is not super helpful, but for me, I kind of get to a point where I'm like, am I going to make substantive changes on this paper? Like, are there things that more iterations are going to change that are going to make a difference in a review process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we can tweak something here, we can tweak something there. I mean, there's always something that can be done, enhanced, changed, whatever. But for me, have I gotten to a point where like things seem internally consistent? There seems to be contributions that I think we have articulated, although of course you always learn after the first round of reviews that no, you did not articulate those contributions well. But I think my sense is just, I tend to submit when I just feel like there's not going to be substantial changes between now and whenever it's submitted.
Okay, when you feel like you've done as much as you can do individually on it, you need at this point to get another set of eyes looking at it in order for you to make any further progress.
Although we will at that point have had other eyes on it, right? That like we will have had other friendly reviewers or colleagues look at it. So it's not that it's just us.
We also presented it at the Academy and in a symposium focused on identity work. Heather, you presented it to some colleagues in Cincinnati as well, I believe, right? In internal workshops. So, we did get a lot of feedback before we submitted.
And if I may speak a bit to the experimentation process,
Please,
I think this is one thing that makes theory so very difficult is that you're not bound by your data.
right?
I mean, I am an editor at an empirical journal, and there's only so much you can do with the data that you have. Like reviewers, I mean, they can say go collect more data and find something entirely different, but you know, with theory, the sky's the limit. I mean, it's just
right. You know, and I once had a doctoral student who one of my colleagues commented, "Oh, that guy, he sees everything as connected to everything else." And that really impeded his progress through the doctoral program, because you can't make a contribution that way. Because, you know, I mean, in reality, everything is connected to everything, right? And so the boundaries on a theory are, you know, are not predetermined by anything. You know, you can potentially draw the boundaries around a theory anywhere you want to, but you need to make smart decisions about where to draw those boundaries, so that your contribution is clear and it's highlighted and in focus, and so that you're making a contribution that people value. So, you know, so how any insights on that, on just this general issue of where do you draw the boundaries around a theory? You know, what to, you know, in terms of what to include, what to exclude, that sort of thing.
I think the review for me personally, obviously I can't remember how we definitely got to the final point where we were ready to submit, but the review process was really helpful with that piece of it, Rich. So the reviewers, they had different perspectives, but there were certain things that they said, this is really cool. Identity opportunities, that's great, especially in contrast to threat. So, you know, look at that some more. The network is a really cool thing to build on. It was more like, you know, the outcomes. And then we also had moderators regarding, you know, what is it that makes a person more likely to interpret an event or experience as a threat versus opportunity. So we had lots of cool things. We tried to mush it all in there, because a lot of times you think, oh, this is really cool and that's cool, and they're, you know, connected and they all impact each other in a different way. But the review team really helped us to chop out, these things are extraneous, this is what's really core to the paper, and push further in that area.
Yeah, it's kind of like the theorist's version of the blue book syndrome, you know, where you give a final exam to the students and you ask a question on a topic and they fill the blue book with everything they know about the topic, regardless of whether it has anything to do with the question or not. And that's a dangerous way to write a paper, of course, because then you run the risk of burying your best contribution amid a whole, you know, haystack of of other things that are not such great contributions. So you may bury the needle in the haystack for the reviewers. So that could be risky.
Well, and one of the things that I think makes Christine and I a good duo is that we kind of tend to veer in different directions, right?
Yeah, it's true.
Balance each other out. So I think Christine will not argue if I say that I tend to veer towards complexity. And she tends to veer towards simplicity. And so usually I'll send her a draft and she's like, okay, the ideas are fine, but there's way too many of them. Can we take out like half of them, please? And I'm like, no, they're all brilliant.
And they are all brilliant. Heather is brilliant. All her ideas are great. She just has too many of them. So I have to be a little bit of the voice of reason sometimes. Right. Yeah, and they may be
sides.
Exactly. They may wind up being 3 papers rather than 1. Right.
That's kind of funny that you might say that, Rich. Leave that for another conversation.
Have 2 more papers under review somewhere, I guess. Okay, well, good. Okay, so let me ask this: what made this project interesting enough for you to want to devote your time and attention and effort to it?
Sure. Well, I can take this one also. So I was really excited by this idea of identity opportunities. I think, as I mentioned, because the impetus came from the retirement study, and then I saw it again in my dissertation. So I really just wanted to write a paper about opportunities. And Heather and I had to negotiate quite a bit over adding in the network. It was definitely the right decision, and she had a really good insight there. But I admit I was most excited about the idea of opportunities. It's a much more positive take. The identity work literature is really very focused on the work that individuals engage in response to identity threats. I like this because it's a much more positive perspective, and I really just felt like it would balance out what's going on in the literature. So that was the first thing. The second thing, as I mentioned, I really love working with Heather. She's been an amazing mentor to me. I think we work really well, and I've just learned so much from her. And it's nice to work with someone who's senior to you, but not so senior that they've, when they were publishing, it was decades ago. Like, she was really in the heart of this in the midst of her career. So I think it was really helpful.
With the AMR backlog, it could have been decades ago.
Okay. I didn't know that at the time, Rich.
Like any day now, we're going to get those.
I know.
Any day.
Hasn't happened yet. The other thing for me, this is my first time. So like I said, I mentioned Heather has published in multiple top tier journals. This was my first time getting an R&R at a top tier journal. So that was hugely
Congratulations.
motivating.
That's great.
Thank you. And I was still pre-tenure at the time. So, so I was super motivated to really try to make sure this thing got accepted at some point. And the other thing is I really enjoyed working with the AE, as I mentioned. He got quite involved after the second R&R. I think he held 3 or 4 Zoom meetings with us to really, because there was just so much going on in the paper as we talked about, and we saw things quite differently. And so just to have this meeting with, I've got, there's this, editor at AMR, and then there's Heather, who's, an associate professor, well-published, and then there's me in the middle. And so it was just really, the dynamic was really interesting. And just to be able to share ideas and to get feedback in real time was really cool. So for me, that the developmental process there was exceptional.
So let me ask you, since this was your first effort to move into making a theory contribution, at least in a top tier journal, for those junior scholars who have not done that before, and this was your first time through the process, were there surprises? Was there anything that you didn't expect that I wish I had known when I first came up with this idea and emailed Heather, that could have helped me through this this process of doing this thing for the first time?
Sure. I had no idea how hard it was going to be. So I think both of you have made comments regarding why theory is so difficult, because as Heather mentioned, it's not bounded by data. It can go in so many different directions. When people read the paper, they have all different types of perspectives, how they're interpreting what it is that you're trying to say. Where's the contribution? That's really tough. And it was just, I actually had some sleepless nights over this paper, Rich, I'll be honest, because I was just so, I don't know what the right word is, but I so badly wanted this thing to get published. I really thought we had something to contribute. And yet it just seemed with every R&R, there were 4 of them before it got accepted, that we basically had to rewrite the paper over and over. And it was so daunting. And at times it's like, why are we even bothered? It's just going around in circles. And yet if we gave up, we wouldn't have what I think is actually a really cool paper that I think will be, probably, hopefully widely cited at some point once it actually gets in print.
I agree with that. I mean, even as a macro person, I found that I learned a lot from reading this paper, and I found very engaging, and very easy to read for me, even though I really know none of this literature. So I appreciated that about the paper. And yeah, I get your point that everybody who looks at a paper is looking at it from a different perspective, right? All those reviewers, all those editors, all those friendly reviewers from down the hallway, they all have their own unique perspective. They're all trying to figure out, how does this relate to the work that I do, or the work that I know? And they're trying to be helpful, right? But sometimes their efforts to be helpful may not be that helpful if they're pulling you in different in directions that are away from the core contribution of the paper, or if multiple people are pulling you in different directions, right, in conflicting directions. I had a friend of mine who was a year ahead of me in my PhD program, who, in terms of forming a dissertation committee, he advised, when 2 dogs fight over a bone, the bone loses. So, you definitely want to avoid that. And yet that's what the review process can turn into sometimes, if you have 2 dogs fighting over the bone.
Sure.
So yeah, I definitely get that can be a challenge. So there's a little bit of a cat herding kind of activity that goes into managing the review process as an author, right? In terms of getting all the constituencies focused on the contribution that you want them to be focused on, right?
Right.
I think we were pretty lucky with that, actually. Our reviewers were pretty on board with it.
Good.
Yeah,
from the beginning. I think that they saw value. Didn't think it was there yet for a while, but I think they were pretty on board with what we were trying to do.
Okay, but they saw a lot of devil in the details, huh?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So what were the biggest challenges that you faced on this project, and how did you overcome those challenges?
Christine's gonna kill me. I think one of the biggest challenges is that, honestly, we just didn't see eye to eye with the editor on some things. We just disagreed. And ultimately he won. Like, there were some things that we really wanted to do with the paper that there just wasn't space for. I mean, it was just a fact. Like we thought they were interesting and exciting, and so it took us a long time to get there. I mean, I don't think it was until like the third round or something that we're like, fine, we'll drop it. And
so, some other editor will find those more interesting, and that'll be another second paper.
But yeah, so that was one of the big challenges, and I think another was just the perseverance that Christine mentioned earlier, that it was a long process, and sleepless nights and anxiety. I mean, we both really cared about it and really believed in it and thought that, it should be out there. But, this is one thing I think I told Christine. What I have learned in my experience is that sometimes when you can't sleep, when you're ruminating on it, when it's just stuck in your head, like it's this terrible feeling. You just feel like, okay, I'm not making any progress. I can't get anywhere. Like, what are we going to do? To me, that tends to be a trigger to like insight, that I will usually get to a point of insight soon when I have that feeling. So if I can kind of tell myself, okay, this is part of the process. This is how we get to the insights, is all of this anxiety and sleepless nights.
Right.
At least that's what she told me anyway, to calm me down. Like, Christine, this is actually good. We're going to get to a good place soon.
We call that the gift of desperation. Desperation is the mother of willingness.
There you go.
Necessity may be the mother of invention, but desperation is the mother of willingness. So let me steer a somewhat different direction here for the last question, which is my question about impact, right? So what impact do you hope that this paper will have? And I when I asked this question to authors on this channel, I kind of divided up into what I see as 5 different arenas where impact could take place. What do you hope will be its impact on future theory, on future empirical research, on future practice, on future pedagogy, or perhaps even on future policy? So you can think about any of those, and obviously some may or may not apply, but pick one or two and tell us what do you think what impact do you hope the paper will have on one or two of those areas of future theory, future empirics, future practice, future pedagogy, or future policy?
Well, I'll start with theory. It's the easiest one, I think. Well, first, we have started to see this paper be cited, and we've been sort of surprised at what it's been cited for. A lot of people are citing the identity implicating events terminology, which was just sort of honestly a throwaway. But I think that's kind of been interesting. But more substantively, like what I hope that people will take from it is to look for opportunities, right? Is to investigate these identity opportunities that people experience, and what are the implications of them? How do they, manifest? How do people capitalize on them and, become new versions of themselves? I also think that the impact of identity work on the network is really important, that I think a lot of the identity work literature has stopped prematurely when talking about like the impact that a thread or an opportunity can have on the self. It just talks about that one identity, but not the identity, not the whole network of identities. So I am hoping that this will spur more research that looks at, kind of how one identity can trickle through or reverberate through the whole network. So those are what I see as some of the bigger, hopefully, contributions that will be impactful.
Right, and on that first one, I guess when you do write that paper about the moderators, I would think that would be, where the threat versus opportunity thing would maybe get a little bit more in focus, right? Because I imagine this is exactly the kind of thing where some see the glass half empty and others see it half full. And there could be, some basic personality aspects that could play into the interpretation of the same event as either a threat or an opportunity or both.
Right.
Right. Sure. There's, the old saying that, crisis equals, what is it? Opportunity plus, I forget, opportunity plus, maybe it's opportunity and threat, but I can't remember exactly. Anyway, so good. Okay, so what other impacts do you think the paper will have, or do you hope the paper will have?
Well, for me personally, I look at it again because I'm obsessed with this idea of identity opportunities. And just from more of a practical, even pedagogical, as someone who, mentors and coaches students, I've always very much believed that it's never too late to be whoever you want to be. And I do hope the paper will send the message that if you see an identity opportunity, go for it. It may seem daunting or impossible, but it's not. I mean, I've got colleagues who, receive their PhDs in their 50s or 60s, and I've got some students in the classroom who are in their 40s. In fact, I've got one student this semester who will be graduating with his son on the same day in May. Wow. I mean, to me, that's just really cool that people just, if you want to get a college education or change your career, or once you retire, go on and do something, start a business, or go, to the other side of the world and be a missionary, whatever, it's never too late to take advantage of these identity opportunities to become who you want to be.
That's very encouraging. Well, that's all the questions I really have for today. So let me thank you both again for sitting for the interview for our little AMR Origin Series ritual. It is an excellent paper. And as I mentioned earlier, even as a macro researcher, I found it very readable, very understandable, and I recommend it highly.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
It was fun.
My pleasure.